Hi, I'm Jill with the Mobile Public Library, and I'm back again with another knitting video. In this one, I'm going to go over the various knitting supplies that you may see in the knitting store or online, and what they're good for and why you might want them. So let's start with needles. The first needles I ever bought was a basic set. These are Boylan, they're metal needles, they're 10 inches long, and this is US size 6, 7, and 8. And this is kind of your medium size standard needle. And I went for years not wanting to knit anything that needed anything else but these. Like, these were all I had for many years, and I got all the projects I wanted to do done. However, there are a lot more sizes than this, and you will need some of those other sizes for certain specialty projects. I got into knitting little amigurumi, and with these bigger needles, you will end up with like little holes. Like, your knitting's loose enough, you'll end up with little holes in it. Just for example, this is something knit on a size 8 needle, and you can see through that cloth a little bit. If I use the same size needle for something like this, the stuffing on the inside would sort of poke out the little holes, so you need a smaller needle. So since I was in the market for some smaller needles, I decided to try out bamboo, because I know some people who just really like bamboo, and I got some 3 1/4 needles. But the bamboo actually came in a full set. I got all the different sizes of needles at the same time, and they go from little teeny tiny needles to giant needles. So I'm pretty much set as far as different sizes. Anything I want to knit, I have the right size needle now. And these are also 10 inches wide. Most knitting needles are actually 10 inches wide, but you can get longer ones. And I did end up getting some longer ones for this sweater project, because if you're making something where the panel, the square that you're knitting, is wider than 10 inches, you're going to struggle a little bit with the shorter ones. So I bought a set of different sizes, metal needles, because after comparing bamboo and metal, I like metal better. And these are 14 inches long. On the subject of metal versus bamboo, it really truly comes down to personal preference. The differences between the two, there's 3 key differences. The metal is a little heavier than the bamboo is, so depending on how you like it, to the feel in your hand, you may like one more than the other. Then the second thing is the texture. Metal is of course a lot more slippery than the bamboo is. I knit fairly tight, so having a little more slip helps me. However, if you knit really loose, you may like a little more grip, like you get with the bamboo. And then the third thing is durability. Now, for most people, this is not going to make a difference. However, I am pretty rough on my needles. I do the scale mail knitting, and I have broken several bamboo needles on these scales because they are heavy and they are metal, and the edges of them are a little bit rough. So I have broken bamboo, whereas metal, I might scratch the needle, but it's still going to be perfectly intact and usable. I have also broken bamboo needles by, when it's a thinner needle, just getting halfway through a project, throwing it in my bag, carrying the bag around, sitting on it, slamming it around, and then I open it up and the bamboo needle has been broken because I treated it too roughly. So those are 3 things you want to consider. And that's pretty much for straight needles. These straight needles, they have a point at one end and they have a cap at the other. They're basically what you think of when you do knitting needles. What they're good for is knitting flat pieces, scarves, panels that you're going to sew together to do a sweater. But like I said, it's going to be all flat pieces of material, and you can reshape the material, adding stitches and subtracting stitches, but it's going to be one flat piece, and to make a completed thing, unless it's a scarf, you're going to have to sew different pieces together. And then I'll also mention about the sizing. There is US sizing, there's UK sizing, and then there's metric sizing that everybody else uses. They are all the same needles, and you can look up a conversion chart online. These needles, these metal needles, are from a US brand, so it says a size 6, but a size 6 is actually a 4mm wide needle. So if I go through this set and look for the one that says 4mm on it, it will be the exact same size as these. Okay, and then other than your, you know, single pointed needles, which I recommend you start with because they are the easiest to comprehend, most commonly used ones. You also have double pointed needles. And again, you can get them in metal or bamboo. These two sets. They are exactly the same sizes, same length. I started with the bamboo ones, but I broke several of them making this glove, so I replaced them with the metal ones. But what double pointed needles are good for is knitting things that are circular, like socks and gloves, where you don't want to make a flat piece and then put it together and stitch along the edge. You want a tube of fabric. And they usually come in sets of 5. The DPNs or / double pointed needles, they look much more complicated to use than they are, because you will see people knitting and they'll have 4 or 5 needles going at the same time, and you're like, how do you do that? But the fact of the matter is you're only using 2, and the other ones just sort of hang there and hold your stitches for you. So you know, if you watch some videos and look up DPNs, they're not near as complicated as they look to use, but these are what you usually use if you want to do circular knitting. And then third type of needle, and these are the ones I never use these. I mean, I have tried it twice and it did not work for me. These are circular needles, and it's 2 needles with a cord in between. A lot of people love circular needles, and they are, in theory, the most versatile type of needle because, one, you can just knit from one needle to the next and then back, just like you do with the straight needles, and you just have this extra cord to act as a place to hold your stitches. So that means that you can use it no matter what the width of your project is. You know, you wouldn't have to get a 10-inch needle or a 14-inch needle. You could just use this for any width, as long as you had enough cord length in between the 2 needles. You can also do circular knitting, where you know, you knit from this needle to this needle, and then you scooch it around the cord over to this side and pick up from there, and you're going around and round. So you don't have to have 2 different sets. You can just use these. You can also, a lot of them have different cord lengths, because depending on, like, if you want to do a blanket, you would need a much longer cord than if you're doing like a little hat. And you can, to some extent, like if you got too long a cord, you know, like you're doing a little project and you got a long cord, you can just pull that cord out of one side of the project, but it's more area that you've got to scooch those stitches around. So a lot of people like to switch out for a short cord when they're doing a small circular project. But I say, you know, these are supposed to be very versatile. Some people love them, and I might grow to love them if I got myself a nicer set. They have this sort of rubbery cord, and where they join the needle is not super smooth, so the whole time I was knitting, I was just fighting it. Like, the stitches would get caught on the join, and they get caught on this rubbery cord, and you know, just the whole experience of just like fighting to get the stitches lined up right the whole time just drove me nuts. So I've used these twice, and both times my project came out laddered. That's where the stitches aren't close enough together and you end up with a hole down it. It looks like a run in a stocking, if you remember what those look like. So, you know, you may want to give these a shot. Like I said, a lot of people love them. I personally don't use them because everything I've tried to do, I can do with DPNs, and I can do with single pointed needles with no problem. Okay, other than needles, let's talk a little bit about yarn. If you have a pattern, it'll tell you what yarn to use. You read the labels of the yarn and you use what the pattern says. If you're just sort of making it up as you go along, maybe you're just doing a scarf and you're like, I don't need a pattern for a scarf, I'll eyeball it. Pick something you like, go by maybe the needle suggestion on the package, and you might go a little up or down from there depending on what you have, or how you knit, or how it's coming out. For just regular projects, one thing I will also point out is the different textures of yarn. This homespun is very fun to knit with, but because it's so puffy and it's not tightly woven, it's very easy to accidentally split the yarn, where you get the needle you get the needle like in between the threads instead of the actual thread, like that, where it's like splitting the thread. So that can be a little difficult, and you also, because it's kind of puffy, lots of times you can't see your stitches as you're working into them, which can be a little confusing. So I don't recommend fancy yarn like this for a beginner. Another reason I don't recommend fancy yarn is you run into things like chenille yarn, which is really pretty soft, but it has no stretch to it. So you can get, like, as you're working along, you get where you just cannot get your needle back into the work. So stick with something like this. This is a worsted yarn. It's got a little bit of stretch to it, but not too much. It's not too puffy. It's pretty easy to work with. It's the kind of yarn that, when you think yarn, that's what you picture. Stick with the basics to start with, and then after you're comfortable, you can branch out from there. On to other knitting things that you may encounter. You're almost definitely going to need a tapestry needle. I've got a wide assortment here. I got metal ones, I got plastic ones. When you knit, your starting thread and your ending thread are going to be sticking out. And you use, let me just show you what I'm talking about. Here's where I started the project. And then over here is where I ended it. And you got this sticking out thread. So even if you're just doing a scarf and there's no sewing involved, you will need to get a tapestry needle or a yarn needle and use it to tuck those thread ends in. And of course, if you're making a sweater or something, you'll want to seam up the sides. You got to sew the different pieces together. So you use the same matching yarn to sew it together, and you most of the time can't even really see where you sewed it together. There is a seam in here, and I can't find it. Oh, there's a seam right here, but I had to really look for it. So I'm not a very good sewer. That is one thing don't worry about with yarn, with the knitted stuff, because as long as your yarn's matching, your seam is usually almost invisible. Let's see, other things that you will find. You might see some of these. These are cable knit hooks or cable knit stitch holders. When you do cable knit, some of your fancier patterns will tell you to reserve or set aside a certain number of stitches, and you would loop them onto one of these to tell you that you set them aside. Then you knit the ones after it, and then you will pick up the ones you set aside and knit them afterwards. So like that's how you get a cable knit. So this is fairly advanced knitting stuff. If you're not doing cable knit or a pattern that says for you to reserve stitches, you don't really need these. I like a counter just to keep track of where I am in a pattern. But again, you could use pencil and paper. You could mark your pattern as you go. There's all different ways that you can keep track. You don't need one of these. You also have these. These are like little rubber ends that you would put on the end of your needle, like if you're in the middle of a project and you don't want it sliding off your needle. They're just little safety bumpers. You don't need to do that, because what I usually do is I jam the work right through the yarn that I'm using, and that keeps it in place. But they may be handy to have. They also make all kinds of different stitch markers, just little plastic things that you can mark stitches with. Lots of times when you're doing a pattern, it'll say mark such and such stitch, and then later on you've got to come back to that spot and sew it together in that spot or something. The stitch markers, again, you can improvise something. A lot of people will use like a regular safety pin or a paper clip or a piece of scrap yarn, because you always end up with these little pieces of yarn. You can tie that in a loop and use that. You don't really need to buy stitch markers. If you've got some, they're kind of not cute and nice to have, but you don't need them. Let me think. Anything else? Oh, and also if you see one of these, this is also one of these things that you use for reserving stitches. So like when I was making another example of that would be when I was making this glove. I was doing it circular, which means you knit up to here, and then you set these stitches aside on one of these, and then you knit up to here, and then you set these stitches aside, and then you knit up to here, and then you come back and pick up some stitches here and knit up. So it's kind of handy. One of these is kind of handy for that. But again, you can just use one of these little yarn needles, piece of scrap yarn, run the yarn through there, and that'll hold onto your stitches perfectly fine as well. So I'd say for things that you need, you really only need some needles, some yarn, and eventually one of these, but you only really need one of these at the end of your project, not at the beginning. And that is pretty much it for yarn supplies. You may also see on the same aisle crochet hooks. There are a few things, a few like knitting hacks where you rescue lost stitches using a crochet hook, but you don't need crochet hooks to knit. And that's pretty much it for knitting supplies. If there's anything you're unclear about or any follow-up questions you have, please leave me a comment. Also, leave me any suggestions you may have about other knitting videos you might want me to do. I am open to suggestion. And that's pretty much it for today. Hope everyone's having a great day, and bye-bye.